Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a philosophy podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm William Nava. All right, so welcome, Professor Jody Azzouni. So Jody, you are a professor of philosophy at Tufts University.
That's correct.
Welcome to the show. I want to talk to you about some of your work on ontology, primarily, and on your book, Ontology Without Borders. But before diving right into it, if you could just tell me a little bit about your overall career. What have you focused on as a philosopher?
Well, as a philosopher, I focused primarily on metaphysics and epistemology, only I wasn't doing it directly, as it were. That is to say, tackling the bread and butter topics, as I do in this book, like individuation conditions and modality. I was focusing on it through mathematics and empirical science. And that's really how I got started. I found those to be important special cases where when I started, I thought, oh yeah, these are special cases which are really kind of clean and which I can take care of quickly and then move on to the more messy cases. And it didn't turn out that way. I literally was working on those 20, 25 years. So that's how it happened. Another major aspect that keeps coming in is really, really important is philosophy of language. Mm-hmm. Okay, these are all in contemporary philosophy. I can go on this way, right? You'll just interrupt me.
Sure, yeah, please.
Yeah,
continue.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Contemporary philosophy, the term I started using 15 years ago was balkanized. Contemporary philosophy is very much subdisciplines, and that means the citation records are very much subdisciplines. So if you're writing in philo of mathematics, people who cite you and talk to you are in philo of mathematics and not outside. In philo of science, there are all these subdisciplines, philo of biology, et cetera, et cetera. And so what basically happens is, even though, in my view, all this work is intricately interconnected, philosophy is hard to read. Philosophers generally are slow, although thorough readers. And as a result, there's a lot of absence of crosstalk. Mm-hmm. And that's the main thing that I discovered over time, is that as I was working on these things, it was very hard to get people in who saw themselves in other subdisciplines to read and interact, even though all the central issues were pretty similar.
Interesting.
So that's an interesting phenomena. And I happen to be, luckily, a fast reader. So I actually can access a lot of this different material. Interesting.
I mean, it strikes me that with ontology in particular, the insights from the philosophy of language and logic are so important. Like you can't. I mean, they're you can't treat them as separate subject matters.
You shouldn't treat them as separate subject matters, and a lot of ontologists don't. But what they end up doing instead is taking what you might call the standard line. Mm-hmm. So to do their particular work, they'll assume Quine's criterion, for example, or they'll assume, broadly speaking, Lewis's approach, David Lewis's modal approach, and then they'll ring changes in that way. But they won't go to what I regard, they won't go back to foundations. They won't go back to saying, how are we supposed to approach logic? How are we supposed to approach? I mean, they often talk as if they're doing so, but you can see from the citation record that they're not doing that. They're like just citing Quine or Lewis or whatever, and not going back and looking at all these substantial debates that went on. not that long ago, sometimes the 90s or around 2000, maybe the 1980s. But what you'll see in the citation record is contemporary citations plus a couple of greats, two or three great people. And that's what it looks like. And you're like, they haven't read anything else, which, again, may or may not matter depending on the issues, depending on the debates. So anyway. That's as much criticism as I'm going to level at the profession at this point. I'm going to stop doing that.
So I want to start about ontology from a very kind of basic question before we get into any of the sort of nitty-gritty details. If you could just sort of characterize well, actually, let me put it this way, because when we talk about ontology, we're obviously talking about what sorts of things exist and what sorts of things don't. So if you could start out maybe by characterizing what are the different kinds of contested objects, because I think maybe that's a good way to start getting a sense of what's at stake.
Okay, well, the list of contested objects is just about anything that a noun phrase covers. So it ranges from theoretical objects such as electrons, galaxies, black holes, to what you might call ordinary middle-sized dry goods. That's Austin's phrase, rugs, tables, chairs, sneakers, to animals, zebras, lions, to groups of these things or collections or kinds of these things, to institutional entities like banks, countries, to legal entities, contracts, notarized documents. And so all of these, there are people who say they exist. There's people that say they don't exist. But of course, all of this is built on intense debate about what these things are like, what their individuation conditions are. Do they have individuation conditions? How do you tell when you've got two contracts, one contract? How do you tell how things evolve? And then, of course, there are these other weird counterexample objects that are floating around, like what you might call, I think this is Lewis's example. I'm going to make it up. Trout turkeys, it's his example. So this is something that's a trout for a number of years and then spontaneously is some other turkey. We would normally think of the trout and the turkey as two creatures, but this person who's pushing trout turkeys says, no, basically it's one object that is what you would call this trout till noon and then that turkey thereafter. Or so there are things like that. And Hirsch has something he calls shrees, which are, they are like our trees during the day, but then at night they don't have branches. So nothing's changed physically, but we don't individuate it the same way.
Okay.
So there are, and all those are possible objects. Some people say yes, some people say no, but often the more interesting debate is how they're ruled out or ruled in by particular philosophers. So that's the list of contested entities, both weird ones and not so weird. Think about a deck of cards, for example, an object, a collection of objects. So.
You didn't mention, but I take it also in the list are numbers and properties.
Oh, of course, I should. Yeah, my bread and butter, as it were. Numbers, properties, functions, abstracta of various sorts. Absolutely. Those are the ones that when people get introduced to a philosophy course, they suddenly discover that people are wondering whether numbers exist or not. Up to that point, they didn't think about it, and when people think, well, physics tells us everything there is, they don't bring in numbers. You think to yourself, collections of objects, etc. But numbers are a big topic.
And then, I guess there are as many as many positions on this as as you can have combinations of yes, those exist, and no, those don't exist. But if you could give a broad characterization of the kinds of positions that there are.
Well, I mean, you can think about the positions in terms of, the lists, but what makes a philosophical position distinctive usually is how things get on the list or off the list, according to the philosopher. So one way to get everything neatly on the list is to say, look, if we have a noun phrase, we got an object, period. If you talk about it, there it is. Your talk is true or false, and therefore those are, it has truth conditions, and those truth conditions are sensitive to the way the object is. And so that's a way of telling a story which gets everything in. And then some people say, no, it's only certain respectable theories that count, let's say your physical theories or one of the other ones. And then so that will have a more refined list. So these are both kind of language roots to saying there are such objects. And then there are other kinds of approaches where people will say, no, you have to bring in certain kinds of metaphysical principles or conditions. Maybe causation, the thing has to be causally active, or maybe it has to be in space-time, or maybe, and these might be called criteria for what exists. And in those cases, philosophers are going to differ over whether there are such criteria or whether there are any criteria. Mm-hmm. And then your lists kind of fall out. Right. As a result of these principles, but these principles in turn are judged or argued for on the basis sometimes of the lists that the philosophers have and sometimes on other considerations. Right. Does that help? Am I?
Yeah, it does. And I think I want to come back to some of these, proposed criteria for existence. But now I think we have something of a sense of what what this realm of questions is, and so now I want to start by asking you about what it seems to me the philosopher that, without exception, is mentioned in all of these discussions is always Quine. He's always like the first guy to come up, and there's this concept of Quine's criterion of ontological commitment, which always seems to be at the center of so much of the debate. Right. Could you talk about what that is?
Sure. Basically, Quine, in a way, doesn't think of it as original. He thinks of himself as clarifying something that was already present in the practice. And the idea is focus on discourses, pieces of speech. And the idea is when you make a speech of a certain sort, which you're doing sincerely, let's say, so you're taking what you're saying to be true in a straightforward way, that carries commitments. It carries ontological commitments. And that is his criterion, is a way of looking at a piece of discourse. Now, it gets technical. You look at a piece of discourse, and what has to happen is you have to render the discourse in what's called first-order predicate calculus. You have to render it in logical terms. Think of that as a kind of translation, but rendering is a better word. And then once you've done that in logic, basically the standard logic that everyone learns when they take a logic course, you've got these little guys there, quantifiers, that show up, and they are the indicators of commitment. Sentences in which they seem to be rendered in natural language in the form of there are blahs. Okay, so if you have a piece of discourse and part of what is required to be true are there are prime numbers or there are neutrinos, that's the commitment. So Quine doesn't go directly for what there is, he goes indirectly. The idea is get a piece of discourse that the speaker, or just look at the discourse directly, what's true in it, see what the commitments are by these phrases. Now, if you choose a discourse that he thinks is the best discourse you can choose, something in the ballpark of contemporary physical science, okay, and you render it and then you clean it up in certain respects, that's what you have to take to be true. Okay. So that's kind of the picture, and that's his criterion.
So the criterion is essentially if you were to render statements about essentially the physical sciences in this logical language, whatever gets quantified are the things that we have to be committed to saying exist.
If we take that discourse to be true, that's right. Exactly. And those are the things we have to be committed to saying that exist. Now, there are already ways that people can start to debate with this. Quine, he varies on this, especially as he got older, but he tended to want to go with the austere physical language. People have argued against this and said, no, you have to include a lot more. You have to include, let's say, history or the social sciences, the psychology, etc. And when you do that, it's not clear how easy it is to render that in first order. But in any case, you get a lot more commitments, or you seem to. Okay, so that can happen. You can get more or less commitments depending on what you allow the discourse to be that you're going to take seriously. You can also get debates if you say, Quine's focused on first order logic. That's not an appropriate choice. There are other logics. Actually, one of the major discoveries we've been grappling with for over a century is there are all sorts of logics. Okay, logic turns out to be a formalism. It's very broad in what you can invent. I mean, almost as soon as we had a logic on the table, formalized, Frege, people started saying, oh, well, I can change the rules. I can have 4 values instead of 2 values. We can have quantifiers do this or that. We can have all sorts of devices. And so now the debate comes down, why first order logic? Why not a richer logic with a modal logic, a intentional logic of a certain sort, etc. So there's a lot of debates there because the commitments that show up, the quantifiers, are sensitive to the logic. They can quantify over less or more if you have the other terminology in the logic take up the work. And then maybe you shouldn't just look at the quantifiers. You should also look at other devices in the logic. So there's lots of ways these debates can go. And it is very technical, but this is the rough overview.
Now,
does that help?
Yes, it does. So it sounds like, you can start with Quine's criterion, as he would have put it, and, change the theories that you're committed to, change the logic you're committed to, but still, what makes it still some version of Quine's criterion is that you're still deciding what you're committed to based on what gets quantified. Right.
Now, and you're focusing on the discourse. That you're actually rendering in one way or another. Now, as I said, I may not have said this. I should have said this. Of course, this is Quine. But you realize a lot of people starting in the 1990s started to rebel against this in a number of different ways.
So a question, and this might have something to do with why some people rebelled. Why the focus on the quantifiers? What makes a quantifier have this sort of special role where we should consider it to be telling us so much about what we're ontologically committed to?
Excellent question. And one of the really depressing facts is that when you go back and you read what Quine has to say on this, you don't really get an argument. On what there is, which is the seminal paper, it's kind of a popular paper, okay? And at least right away people started to worry. I mean, Quine in that paper kind of gives an argument why he doesn't want to take names seriously instead, and he seems to give an argument, although it's not clear that he does, that you shouldn't take predicate phrases seriously. But of course, all of this has been challenged. And there's it's a really good question. Why the quantifiers rather than names or some other aspects of the logical formalism, first order or otherwise. It's a tangled debate, and there's no straightforward answers. Okay, and if you find that there are other philosophers, major philosophers, who simply disagreed, and thought names mattered, or thought that the predicates mattered, or a certain set of predicates mattered, and it had to be indicated. I've written a lot about trying to adjudicate this, but since I eventually just reject the criterion altogether, reject kind of this discourse approach, I can see this as I do as an interminable debate without resolution. Okay.
So before going to the reasons why you reject it, which I want to come back to, it seems that an obvious way you can go from Quine's criterion is you say, well, okay, let's say I have some theory I'm committed to. Maybe like Quine, I'm just committed to kind of the physical sciences, and there's some true statements there that are having me quantify over some entities that I actually don't want in my ontology.
Right.
So it seems like I might be able to want to say something like, is there a way I can translate, rephrase, just make linguistically tweak this statement so that it's still really saying the same thing, but it's no longer requiring me to quantify over this entity. Could you say a bit about that?
Absolutely. That essentially is Quine's major work, Word and Object, which is an exercise in sophisticated paraphrase. So, first of all, he's not going to say the same thing. He's going to drop that locution. Okay. What's important is you've got in the natural sciences or in a piece of discourse locutions that are doing something. You're drawing certain implications from them. You're describing something. You want to capture those qualities. Okay. You might call it, roughly speaking, the function. So when you translate it or render it in first order terms, you want to keep those functions. Okay, so if you've got phrases that quantify over things you don't like, successful paraphrase is finding new sentences that do the job you need but don't quantify over these unpleasant entities. And that's the project. Okay, that's essentially the project. For Quine, the borders of the project are you have to stay first order. Okay, and so he was convinced you can't paraphrase away the use of mathematics in the sciences. So you have to be committed to mathematics, and that made him a reluctant Platonist, which was something that people found admirable in a way. Here's a philosopher who has nominalistic lusts. He wants to not believe in these things. And he says, I can't do it because I need the language to be first order, and I need to be able to engage in certain kinds of inferences and make certain kinds of descriptions. So I'm stuck. So a lot of the literature in philosophical literature in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, 90s even goes on, is trying to get around this. There were a lot of people who, for one reason or another, said, we really hate Platonic objects. We really hate being committed to numbers and functions and stuff like that for any number of reasons. And so sometimes they were trying to do it within Quinean constraints, but most of them didn't. Most of them changed the logic in one way or another, went to what are called higher order logics or modal logics of one sort or another, intentional logics, where and then hung on to his criterion as far as the quantifiers were concerned. So that, and then they discovered one way or another, in this case, you don't need to quantify over the mathematical objects. So we have honored nominalism. You see, that was the project. People countered that by saying, no, the commitments are hidden. They're still in the language, but now they're hidden in talk of necessity, or they're hidden in other aspects of the language, so that you really haven't done the job you promised. Okay, and so the debate went on. Okay, ontology, nearly enough, is a subject in which very good, high-quality arguments are presented that only the authors of those arguments or a small coterie around them believe. It's a very strange phenomenon. You know, it's similar to making puns. You may have noticed that usually the only person who finds a pun funny is the person who made the pun. Everybody else experiences one or another aspect of a kind of wince response. The same thing is going on in ontology, full scale. I mean, you'll see almost no one agreeing with anyone else on the arguments, on the assumptions, and this is something I've been focusing on much more recently, on the properties of natural language. No one's agreeing. So, but again, the arguments are very sophisticated by very clever and smart people. It's weird.
Yeah. Now,
but it's where I live. Anyway, go on. This is the place where I live.
So you mentioned that, you know, if you're willing to use a different logic than just the standard first order logic, you might be able to get away with not having to quantify over certain kinds of objects. I take it including numbers. So you might be able to. Well,
there's a giant literature where the target was always mathematical objects. So yes, including numbers. Then there's a divisional split. You know, some people are going, yeah, numbers are bad, but you know, points, geometrical objects, they're okay. Because, you know, they're in space-time, so we kind of have access to them. And then there are other people who are going, you're out of your mind. Of course those are not okay. So there's a split there where some people feel, no, the obligation is you can't quantify over them either, and other people think you can quantify over them. So yeah, but then sometimes the logic can enable you to avoid it, and sometimes it can't. So yeah, you've got all of these options.
Now, it seems to me that a very intuitive way to respond to this is to say, look, if by hypothesis what you're doing is sort of switching around your logic in order to be able to, get around these commitments by not having to quantify over these kinds of entities, but you're still in some sense, right? What you're doing a translation job, so there still has to be some kind of match to the original thing that you were saying.
Right. But I wanted to. They call it a functional match. In other words, you're able to do the job.
So what? I guess that I guess my question is what's the job? Or put another way, how do you in this project? How do you judge whether your translated sentence, is really doing the same job as the original one? I mean, there's got to be some change since now there was a commitment that isn't there anymore. So there must be some difference in your translated sentence.
Right.
How do you judge whether this translated sentence is in the relevant sense equivalent to the original one?
Okay. Well, one way you can do this is the following. One way is, let's say you have a bunch of mathematics that you need, okay? Something simple. You need to count the objects, or you need to have a function mapping collections of objects to other collections of objects, where the objects in question are just purely respectable physical objects. What happens in the other language is that you find ways of counting that don't involve saying the number of blahs is the same as the number of blahs. So you have sentences that say other things, but enable you to count. or enable you to describe the function. So that's how it's done. You literally kind of get a structure of a sentence structure that you can then plug in and it does the job. You see what I'm saying? That's one thing. Now, I detected another question here, though. And the question might have been, look, you carry out this rendering in another language. How do you know that the commitments to the objects are really gone? How do you know they're not still there, hiding? You can't just say, well, in this language, my quantifiers act this way, so therefore I'm okay. Because the opponent's going to say, no, it's hiding there. So you need some way of comparing languages. Now, that's very hard. Quine basically kind of almost stipulated, I don't know what this language is doing until I've translated it into first-order terms. Then I know what it's doing. And then the opponent says, well, what made first-order terms the judge and jury here? So that debate actually occurred. There's Quine, there's Boulos, debating exactly that kind of issue. Now, I came in at a certain point and said, well, here's a way of doing it. Okay, think of the logic. It's an interpreted language. It's not just formalism. We're saying things here. So you think of it, what's called its semantics, and you think of its logical properties. And what you want to do is, if you're going to compare it to the first order language, what you need to do is say, how do I have to change the first order language to get something that imitates that? And then let me look and see what I've done to the first order language to get it to be a logical formalism with semantics, as it's called, just like this thing. And then you can see from the first order point of view what you've added and where you've added it. And you've got, as it were, a transcription that's not just a translation into a different formalism, but two logical forms that are equivalent.
So let me see if I understand this. I'm not sure if I do. In a way, let's say I have a sentence that is a scientific claim made in roughly a combination of a natural language with a little bit of physics sort of
and mathematics
in it.
Yeah.
And I want to translate it to first order logic in order to sort of play this game, and sort of my question is, how do I? The question was, how do I judge once the translation is done that exactly how accurate the translation was, in a sense, right? What commitments from it have been carried over, which haven't?
Well, accuracy is not to be judged in terms of the commitments.
Okay.
Accuracy is to be judged in terms of you were doing the science in a certain way. You were using the mathematics to make inferences, and then you were getting descriptive statements that were supposed to cover a range of cases, right? You want the translation, the rendering in first order logic to be able to do that. That's what I'm calling the functional role.
I see.
So you can still carry out the inferences, and you still got statements which give a range of cases that we want to characterize, and we're able to do it. So that's what's being captured. The commitments aren't part of the deal.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That's exactly what's being disputed.
Right.
In the natural language, it looks like you have certain commitments, although Quine said, who knows what's going on in natural language? Forget it. That's just a big mess. At least sometimes he talks that way, right? Now we know what the commitments are once we first order rendered it, and other people are going to go, no, I'm going to do the same thing that you're doing. I'm going to capture the functional role. I'm going to capture the deductions. Only in my formalism, it doesn't have those commitments. And I've done the job I'm supposed to do. And now the question becomes, given these two renderings, which one are we supposed to take seriously about what the commitments are? Right.
It's interesting in that there seems to be implicit in this a view of science in which science doesn't is almost scientific practice is almost insufficient to tell us about what kinds of things actually exist.
That's right.
Scientific practice almost just tells us, these are the constraints put on by the way we carry out this practice, and now you might be able to gerrymander what actually is or exists or doesn't exist based within those constraints.
That's right. And an important part of the practice that's being honored are the apparent truths. Okay, but truths are whole sentences, whereas ontology is in a way how you break up the sentence or how you interpret the sentence in a certain respect. And the claim is that's something science doesn't tell us. It just gives us some truths, things we want to take to be true. And that's one of the constraints.
But the truths are, I take it, going to be judged. The relevant part of the scientific practice that we are trying to match, that we're saying is the function that has to stay the same, is going to be judged, I take it, relative to, like the empirical aspects of science.
Science isn't just the collecting of truths and the putting them in the museum of truths, right? Science, you apply the science all the time in a lot of ways, and that's a big aspect of what's going on that needs to be philosophically analyzed. But yeah, the truths are always, as it were, applied to the world or applied to phenomena, and that the ability to use scientific truths that way has to be sustained by the rendering in the formalism. That's important. You've got to be able to do the same thing with the sentences that in your formalism.
So now let me come back to your position on this. So you said that you eventually just rejected Quine's criterion.
Right.
Yeah. Can you say sort of why and what your view is?
Well, in one way, I rejected the criterion because I didn't see that anyone had given an argument for it that was successful. There are two forms of argument. One of them is in Quine. It's something like, why are the quantifiers the guys that tell us what we're committed to? Because when we learn logic, we subvocalize there is when we see the backwards E. And there is, at least some central use of it in natural language, is the committing idiom. Okay? Another argument that I don't find in Quine, but I found elsewhere, is something like, look, when we interpret a formal language, we use Tarski tools invented by Alfred Tarski, the logician. We use his kind of semantics, and his semantics require, as an interpretation of these languages, a domain of objects. And that's built into how we understand these sentences. And both of these arguments turn out to be wrong. Okay? In natural language, there is very broadly used, whether I intend to be committed to something or not. For example, it's a natural thing to say, there are as many Greek goddesses as there are gods. Or there is a woman that Heather and Sally, an imaginary woman. There is an imaginary woman that Heather and Sally dream about nightly. These are uses of there is. They're straightforward uses. There's no commitment in natural language. And the formal argument about Tarskian semantics is simply mistaken. There's no a domain of objects that's required. What there is a certain relationship between the language that's being interpreted and the language doing the interpreting. And that thing doesn't require commitments. So semantics doesn't require commitments at all. All right? So
is the point of view regarding Tarski that natural language implicitly makes use of these domains, or just that we need to make use of these domains when we're carrying out formal exercises?
Well, it could have been either version of the argument could have been run, and the response is that neither is correct. Okay, run it either way. It's not true of natural language, and it's not true of formal artificial languages, which in this case would be used to try to interpret something that's going on in natural language.
And your reason for saying that the argument doesn't work is essentially something like, even if you do require domains, you don't require ontological commitment to have domains.
That's right. That domain turns out it's actually metaphorical talk. What it really is a technical relationship between two sets of quantifiers. One set in the object language, that's the one that where you say things like there are sneakers on the table, please take them off, and the meta language which says the sentence there are sneakers on the table is true if and only if, and then there's this big long speech using other quantifiers in the meta language. Mm-hmm. Since there are only quantifiers all the way up, if there's no commitment on the ground floor, there doesn't have to be commitment further up either. Commitment just never comes into it. Okay, ontology never comes into it. The word domain is a metaphor that can be dropped out altogether from your talk, and you've captured everything that's going on in Tarskian semantics. That's the point. That's why there's no argument here. Metaphysics doesn't come out of your semantics. The point generalizes pretty much to all forms of semantics. Metaphysics doesn't come out of your semantics unless you put it in there to begin with. Okay, but that's begging the question against the opponent who says we don't need to do this. Okay? Now, let me turn to my positive position just to state it, and then you can go back and raise any kind of issue you want. The positive position is something to the effect of, let's ask ourselves how we really, because here's a crucial assumption I'm making that a lot of philosophers have disagreed with. Ontology is one of the topics that philosophers, however professional, share with everyone else. Everyone's concerned with ontology. Everyone's concerned simply because we have debates all the time. The most famous debate is one about God. Okay, does he exist? Doesn't he exist? We all know what we think we mean by that. We all, and lots of other, we're always wondering, do these things exist? There's a big debate about microbes at one point. There was a big debate about atoms, etc. These were all ontological debates. We take ontological debate seriously. So now the question is, how is it expressed in natural language? And then how can you express it in a formalism? And my view is we do it, kind of the way it looks like we do it. We kind of stamp our foot. We say, I'm concerned with, what really exists. And we also have a criterion. When we ordinarily describe ourselves as thinking that something exists or doesn't exist, we don't mean we made it up. We mean it's there in the world. It exerts force back at us in some way. Okay? So we have lots of examples, as we ordinarily speak, of things that we don't think exist. Cartoons, fictional objects, mythological things, and then we have a bunch of things that we do think exist. Our neighbors, other people, sand, rocks, and so on. These are paradigmatic cases that we divide. There can be cases we dispute about, right? Philosophers dispute about properties. Non-philosophers don't worry about properties, but they worry about Bigfoot or angels or whatever. So that's kind of my picture. So my picture is don't directly go after discourse, go after debate. What we use the discourse to. When are we arguing with each other about what exists and what doesn't? And how do we indicate to each other that we're doing that?
Yeah, and
anywhere you want from that.
I was just going to say that even if, non-philosophers will not debate Shrees, I think was one of the ones you mentioned, or
that's right,
or any of these kinds of things, the fact that they do debate some things, like, God, for example, I suppose means that there are also implicit, and again, not that people necessarily have perfectly consistent views on this, but there seem to be implicit sort of meta-ontological positions on how you kind of decide whether something exists or doesn't, since people are having debates on whether, God exists or doesn't.
I do think that's right. I do think that's right. And people can find out, and it's certainly possible in principle, that people might disagree on their meta-ontological assumptions. Although, I mean, the important difference between philosophers and non-philosophers isn't their interests, it's the kind of detail that is taken to analyzing what's driving a position. Okay, what are my assumptions? And often none of that is explicit. That's what you kind of learn to try to do in philosophy, is get explicit about what's driving the position you have. So people might discover, for example, or someone might discover, you know what? I do have a meta-ontological position. My criterion, I do have a criterion for what exists. The thing had better be in space-time. Mm-hmm. If it's not in space-time, I'm kind of skeptical. And other people might disagree. Now, I actually think there's a general position almost everyone has, which is what I call mind and language independence. Okay, and that needs a little spelling out, but I indicated it roughly. You sit down with your child who not unaccountably given our culture, but is convinced Mickey Mouse exists, and you say, honey, he doesn't exist. Okay? That's straightforward. You're explaining to your child there is no Mickey Mouse. Okay? And maybe you've got a criterion in place, maybe you don't.
Yeah, so it seems to me that based both on sort of standard practice, but then also in terms of what I've seen in the literature, that mind and language independence, and then also having some causal effect are like two sort of very popular kind of meta-ontological kind of criteria for determining whether something exists.
I think the causal one is called the Eleatic principle, which I'm probably mispronouncing because it's, But yes, that is a popular one. Mind and language independence is also popular. And it's a subtle question, which we hold, which we should hold. Yeah.
Now,
and test it.
Now, I know that I take your position is some version of nominalism, as I understand it. Can you actually first just say, in very broad terms, what that means coming from you before I kind of ask you some other questions about it?
It's broad. Okay. I essentially think that all there is what you might label concreta. Okay. Not necessarily things in space and time, because space and time might turn out to be parochial. Maybe there are many dimensions. Maybe there's some other way we should characterize, okay, the medium in which things that exist are in. But there's a whole list of items that I exclude, primarily because I think we can tell a story about how we made up made them up. And so in my list, of course, are most mathematical objects, if a mathematical terminology is functioning in physics as a kind of code for something physical, then what it's coding for, we do take to exist. But generally speaking, mathematical abstracta don't exist. Properties don't exist. So I'm not committed to those things. A host of mental entities, cartoons, made up kinds of objects, none of these exist. So someone like Van Inwagen thinks fictional objects exist. Actually, that position is, a lot of people have that position. Kripke originally, I think, maybe not originally, but close to originally. I don't think those things exist either. So it's a big list. These days I'm more inclined not to say if it's not concrete, it doesn't exist. I'm more inclined to say, let's look at the history of how the term got into our language and what it traces back to. Were we being sensitive to something the term was supposed to cover or not? And if we're not being sensitive, it doesn't correspond or refer to anything. It doesn't, what it's talking about doesn't exist.
So I want to ask you, I think first, I'd like to ask you about reference, which I think, such a kind of classic problem when you're discussing things that don't exist. Presumably I can say things about Santa Claus and about Pegasus. I can say true things about them. I can say a true statement about say Santa Claus. So how does that, in your view, work?
Yeah, what's going on there is complicated. The first thing to say is that we experience what I call a cognitive aboutness illusion. We know, you and I are on the same page about Pegasus and Hercules, I presume. You're not a pagan. There's no Pegasus, there's no Hercules. Nothing exists. There's not something that has those properties, right? We cannot escape the impression that if I'm saying Pegasus doesn't exist, I'm not talking about Hercules. And if I say Hercules doesn't exist, I'm not talking about Pegasus. And if I say Pegasus is depicted as a winged horse, obviously that's false of Hercules. So there's this inescapable impression we're talking about things. Okay, that's a cognitive illusion. What's really going on is there are sentences which have truth values. Okay, and the sentences in which the word Pegasus appears and in which the word Hercules appears, some of them agree on their truth values, like Pegasus doesn't exist, Hercules doesn't exist, but some of them disagree. Okay, and now you have to tell a story about how those sentences get to be true or false. And the story doesn't involve objects. It doesn't involve Pegasus. It doesn't involve Hercules. It better not. It involves a practice that we engage in of talking about here in scare quotes, mythological characters. So in a case like Sherlock Holmes, where the same thing is true, we end up going back to the stories. And we look for statements that are in the stories. And those statements in the stories is what licenses the claims, making the statement about Sherlock Holmes true or false. So that Sherlock Holmes is depicted as being born in New York, false. Okay? But it's not because the word Sherlock Holmes refers to an object that has the property of not being born in New York. It's because it's made true, as it were, by the story. Now, there are lots of tweaks and things that have to be done to this to make it work, but that's roughly the idea. And so when you're dealing with something that does exist, let's say this glass is on this table, I don't know if the audience, you can see the glass on the table, that's made true by the glass being on the table. But Sherlock Holmes is smarter than Mickey Mouse. That's not made true by Sherlock Holmes bearing a certain relationship to Mickey Mouse. That's made true by a set of stories, which the sentences do not talk about. That's my picture.
Yeah.
So you have to tell a story to get reference to work. You have to tell a certain story about truth. The story I tell about truth we can call, I used to call it a deflationist story, but that's misleading. It's not. It's a neutral story. It's a neutralist story about true. True, what makes sentences true is sometimes correspondence to actual objects, but sometimes it's not. And the talk of true is completely neutral about that.
Okay.
Okay?
So a statement might be true, but just in a way, let's say a statement about, a statement about Pegasus, or even a statement about
numbers,
about the number 3. In a sense, you're interpreting them as being, well, the truth conditions of them are given by some kind of practice. In one case, it might be the practice of the empirical sciences. In another case, it might be the sort of practice of talk about mythological objects.
That's one way to put it. I mean, but you have to be careful because truth conditions is terminology. For a lot of philosophers, they like what's called truth conditional semantics. And so they'll say, and I don't have a disagreement with this, the truth conditions for 2 + 2 = 4 is 2 + 2 = 4. So 2 + 2 = 4 is true if and only if 2 + 2 = 4. I don't have a disagreement with that. Okay? If that's the way you want to put it, I would then say the truth conditions are those, but what makes the statement true, maybe you should coin a phrase, truth-making conditions, I don't know, is something else, the practice. Okay? So it's important. There are dangerous, is it shoals that are dangerous? When you're navigating water, I'm terrible about things like this.
I am too, unfortunately. I'm not the right person to ask.
So anyway, there are these dangerous things you face when you're navigating water in a boat. There are dangerous things of that sort in philosophy with terminology. Whereas I just said what you had said, the truth can, which would have been perfectly sensible in one way. The truth conditions are given by the stories or by a certain mathematical practice or whatever. That's not, people would say, oh, you're rejecting truth conditional semantics? And I would say, no, I'm not really. And so I have to put it a different way. Okay, so that's...
Now,
it's unavoidable. Jargon is a big deal in this field.
So there's another... This is a slight moving on to something I think slightly different, but still very much in this realm. Another big position that you outline in your book is what you called object projectivism.
Yes.
So can you say what that is?
Okay. Well, the what you might call my major topic my whole life, in a way, all of my philosophy ties together with this kind of concern, which is it's clear we're in the world. It's clear the world is impacting on us. It's clear that our senses enable us to interact with the world. It's clear that our talk, its truth values, are sensitive to the world in some respect. Regardless, there is a question of what about the world is something we project onto the world and what's there in the world. Now, a lot of philosophers think, I can't do this. You can't make this division. It's all mixed up. Putnam put it at one point. He said that either the trail, I think he said the trail of the human serpent is all over. So the idea is somehow our conceptualizations are so infiltrate our ability to interact and talk about the world that we can never separate what there is from what we're projected onto what there is? I think we can, and that's what I'm trying to do. Now, the idea of objects without borders, object projectivism, is that a fundamental aspect of objects, just take ordinary objects that we experience, like this glass. This glass, we experience it as ending and beginning in space-time, actually rather precisely, and ending and beginning in space, that's what I wanted to say, and ending and beginning in time. There was a point it came into existence. There's a point it will cease to exist. I'm not going to break it. I don't want it to cease to exist. And we think, and that's part of our understanding of what that object is. So I have a general term for that. I call it its borders. Okay, they can be space-time borders, but there are other kinds of borders as well. The general idea of borders are what are called individuation conditions. What makes this object different from other objects? What makes it the same? Now, my claim is, is that is projected. There's nothing metaphysically in the world that's a border. That's an ontological border in that sense. There are causal differences. As you go through space-time, there are changes in causation, there are changes in the features exhibited, colors, etc., but there are no borders. So it's part of my attempt to separate what we're projecting onto the world, almost biologically, not just psychologically, not just conceptually, and what's there in the world. Did that help? Does that kind of...
Yes, and that to me that makes a lot of sense. Just as an aside, that idea that the borders that individuate separate objects from each other, that those are projected, has always seemed very intuitive to me.
Well, that's good, because I would think, in a way, I think that's right. I actually think our experience of the world allows us to see that it's a projection, what we might call the phenomenology of experience. Now, that's a bit of an argument to try to establish that, but I think it's true. I think we can kind of see this is a projection, whereas it does not feel like the way the object seems to us, not its borders, but as it were, its insides. That doesn't seem like a projection, although a lot of it might be, like colors.
Now here's the question, and I guess I'm going to phrase this as a potential objection to to this.
Yeah, we philosophers, we live for objections, right? That's the field is built on people objecting to other people.
So let me see how I can phrase this. I guess I want to say, sure, you can, as almost like a technical matter, say that the boundaries themselves don't really exist. However, it's almost as if they do, because the way the world comes, it does come with sort of very noticeable, like striking differences in
Absolutely.
how in sort
and
of.
I don't want to deny that.
Mm-hmm. And so
I don't want to deny that at all. I mean, you're waving your hand, right? Mm-hmm. There's a striking, and I'm waving my hand right now. There's a striking difference between this and this, which is changing over time, obviously. Yeah, and I can't deny that.
And so I guess the potential objection I'm trying to phrase is like, in those differences, right, which are separated in space-time,
right.
Well, with that come implicit boundaries, right? Like where those differences end and begin, that's what gives us the boundaries. And so we should actually say that they exist.
You could define boundary that way. Now, it would turn out that a lot of things that we regard as one object, we would have to stop regarding as one object. A deck of cards, a pair of shoes, perhaps us. Because after all, I look continuous, but I'm not, and neither are you. I'm basically as physicists started noting very early, over 100 years ago, I'm mostly empty space with these little packets, or maybe I'm a field, and I'm not even sure how to think about, because I'm not just a field. I'm a rapidly, often changing field, and there's a lot of, So you could define it that way, but, and here's a point, it's kind of a subtle point. Look, what are you adding with that definition that you didn't already have when you were describing the features the way you were, as different? And the answer is nothing. Okay, we're sort of trying to think of, and the way when we think about objects, we're adding something to the fact that the features change. So imagine if you could, see, I'm looking at examples here, and unfortunately, I've wanted so long to give up philosophy, writing philosophy, and become a filmmaker and do films of these things, because I could really get across what I want to say with certain kinds of films. And I kind of, talk about them a little bit or indicate them in Ontology Without Borders, but I haven't done it. So, we have a pen on a table, let's say, just sitting there. And we see it as two objects, okay? But of course, if we saw it as one object, and you can imagine it was like if I carved a sculpture out of a single object, and I carved it so that it looked like there was a pen and a table, but of course it's not two objects, that's one object. It would look exactly the same, and it might even have the same properties. These days you don't carve out of marble. You can make sculptures out of anything. Okay, so the only difference would be it's one object instead of two objects. It wouldn't change anything. The features would still shift, but now it's one object instead of two objects. In that sense, describing something as one object or two objects is ineffable. We're not adding anything metaphysically to what the world is already like. We're just deciding, include this, call it an object. Don't include that and call it an object. Right. But the features themselves, that's changing. And once I describe that, I have described everything metaphysically that there is in the world. Right. There's nothing more to say. And really, my point is coming down to a kind of triviality like that. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of the claim.
It also seems to me that if you wanted to run the line that I was just describing of saying, well, there's these distinct differences, and that kind of implies where the borders are, you have to have a standard for, what counts as these differences, right?
That's right. What are the significant differences and the insignificant differences? Because again, take this pen, there are intra-object differences, lots of them. Like right here, there's this clip, and then you're in the body of the pen. Why isn't that two objects? Why is that one object? And one of the things you do, this was something that was pointed out a lot in a slightly different context a long time ago by philosophers like Hirsch and Inwagen. It's quite asystematic how we in practice decide when we've got two objects and when we've got one object. When you start really looking at it, well, it's weird. And there's nothing systematic at all about it. And what's going on is somehow it's arbitrary, where a shift in features in one case will be treated as a marking, two objects. And in other cases, it's one object. So that if my fingers get stitched together in a certain way, that's not seen as one object. That's seen as two objects that are unpleasantly stitched together. Whereas in other cases, if you cut the thing out and you have a stitching here, so a certain kind of cloth thing, that will be seen as one object, where you put a pair of pants together and go up and down two pieces and you seal up the seams. That's one object. So there are lots of better examples than the one I just dragged up out on the spot, but we don't think of a sneaker, a lace sneaker, it's one object. Well, why? You just pull the lacing off. It's two objects, and maybe you can pull out the inseam. It's three objects. We in practice don't do that, you know. If it turns out slightly in the future, I can do a robotic hand. You know, I have two or three hands. I screw one on, I screw another. I don't know that we'll start to think of me as several objects. It's very, very arbitrary.
Now, so let me see. This is what I almost want to say based on what we've discussed so far. So let's take an everyday object like the glass that you were holding a moment ago.
Right.
It seems to me, based on what you've said so far, that your attitude toward the glass should be something like, you can make statements about the glass, like I'm holding the glass or the glass is on the table, and those statements
are true.
Are going to be true. They're perfectly. They're totally true statements.
Right.
And yet, as a distinct object, the glass does not exist.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. So, in a certain sense, the earlier stuff we talked about how I want to separate truth from ontology, is an advantage here. Mm-hmm. If you stick them together, the way a lot of philosophers still continue to do, then you can't have my position about the glass and be able to say things that are true. You have to engage in some kind of paraphrase or reduction, or you have to do all these awkward things. I don't. I can say, the glass is on the table, and I don't have to be committed to a glass. And in this particular case, the truth-making conditions aren't going to be a story we tell. It's going to be the features here. Okay, just you're not going to involve the border. That's all, because there isn't a border. But you're able to tell a good story about what makes that statement true.
Now, when you in your book, when you describe object projectivism and as a denial of these borders, you say it's a denial of the borders, and then also a denial of stuff. Am I right in that?
Right. That's right. And a denial of because we have stuff. When we think about stuff, we think about it as like sand, flowing water, and what's going on there is we actually have dropped certain individuation conditions, but not others. In particular, the idea about built into our intuition about stuff, and you can turn it into a logical condition on talking about stuff, is that, as the stuff goes down to the drain, to give an example, the stuff that was here is now there. So you've got an individuation condition over time of same stuff. That's a projection as well. Is it the same stuff? Is it new stuff? There's no real answer to that question. So that's when I said earlier, I started with the example of ontological borders in space-time, but I said it really generalizes to individuation conditions of all sorts. This is the kind of example, this is one of the kinds of examples I had in mind, which is that you're still hanging on to individuation conditions if you think you've got the same stuff here that you have later. Again, there's nothing wrong with talking it that way and projecting. It's useful. But there's nothing metaphysically in the world that's telling you that. Now, that's important because there are ways in which my position was anticipated earlier, in particular by a philosopher named Strawson. But in my view, Strawson confused this distinct position with stuff, what you might call stuff metaphysics, which have been pushed by a lot of philosophers, implicitly or explicitly. There aren't objects, but there's a lot of stuff. And we cut the stuff up in different ways. This is the way Putnam often spoke later in his career. And I'm rejecting that as well. It's a very systematic rejection. It even applies to ways that people want to individuate properties.
Now,
so people might think, I've got two instances of red, or I've got two red tropes that are exactly similar but are not the same. That is also, to me, an unreal distinction, and it turns on having an individuation condition about properties. Okay? So that's in the book as well at a certain point. That's a little more esoteric, but what I'm pointing out, it's the same principle. It's a very systematic saying, look, what's in the world doesn't give you individuation conditions at all.
Now,
along a whole bunch of dimensions.
Yeah. So I think I understand everything you've said so far. Now, the next question that comes to mind to me is, you have talked, I mean, you're not a total sort of nihilist in terms of like, you do believe there is a real world.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, so you've talked, it seems like one thing you've talked about is features, right? So that's
right.
One way that you've put this. Now, do features have individuation conditions?
No. So if you imagine that the color red is a feature, in the world it probably isn't. I mean, I'm sure it's not because it's a color. Colors are relatively parochial. You'd have to go for something else like mass or whatever. But let's just stick with red. It's what I said before. If you think of red as a feature, you might think, oh, you can have two identical things that have the same feature, red. Like a red ball over here and an identical red ball over here. They have the same feature, red. Or you could think you've got two features which exactly resemble each other. Those are two different sets of individuation conditions. If you decide features are one way or the other, you've imposed on the world a specific individuation condition for features. I'm rejecting that.
So all features of the world are entirely distinct?
No, that to say they're entirely distinct is to also do that. Look, here's an analogy. There are philosophers out there who are monists. They say there's only one object, everything. Everything is an object. I say that's still projecting. That's projecting a border around everything. It's not that there are no objects, there are no borders, so to say it's one or it's many, that's a projection. This is a piece of our own conceptualization that we're trying to impose on the world. And it's unavoidable. It's like, I don't even know how to think my way out of it. I mean, I do know how to think my way out of it, but I don't know how to stop thinking that way. It's the same thing as the aboutness illusion. And so this is a general little thing I sometimes describe. I mean, our cognition is an evolutionary product. So it's got all these kinds of ticks and flaws. And here are two of them. Ways in which we can't help thinking about nothing as if it's something. That's one tick. And the other one is we can't help putting borders on things. So that when we realize that there's no border here and it's not real, we end up putting the border around something else or imposing it in some other way. It's a tick. It's a cognitive tick.
So would you say, because obviously at this point we get to a point where, we have to be hyper careful of the way we're speaking, sneaking something into what we're saying that we almost don't necessarily want to, right? So again.
Well,
right?
I mean, I would put it differently. We can keep speaking the way we're speaking, but we have to recognize that we don't want to read it the wrong way ontologically. Remember, I'm perfectly happy saying there are as many Greek goddesses as Greek gods. I don't know if that's true, but let's say it is. I'm perfectly happy saying that, but I don't want someone to come along and sniff out ontology. not that way. And it's the same thing here. I might say, the glass is empty. I'm so sad. I'd like to be able to drink more, but the glass is empty. I don't want someone to try to sneak in ontological borders in that way of speaking. So we have to be careful about that, but we don't have to be as careful about how we're speaking.
So do you think that the extent to which we do have to be careful, do you think that stems from the fact that our language is sort of inherently sort of built around the idea of there being objects?
I think it is, because I think it's built around a psychology of seeing the world as chunking into objects. We don't entirely do that. Like, we almost seem to have two systems, two ontological systems. One is the stuff system, and the other is the object system. And I actually think they're different. And I think one's probably older than the other one, evolutionarily. I'm way out on a limb here, okay? But I'm just speculating. But yeah, our language is very much a product of deep facts about our psychology. So yes, we talk in a way that is very object-laden, in the specific sense of border-laden, and we see the world that way as well. Yeah, and that's where it's coming from.
So I think your position is clear at this point. I want to ask you about. I guess I want to, as a final question, I want to ask you about your attitude about a different take on this. So, actually, one of the first people that I interviewed in this podcast was Amie Thomasson.
Yes.
And her book Ontology Made Easy, I think it's called, was probably the first. I mean, aside from reading on what there is and very cursory glances at other things, her book was kind of my introduction to this like broad topic.
I think it's a good book for that. It's very clearly written. She's generally very fair to her opponents. Not every philosopher is. So it's a good book that way. Sure. And her position is clear.
Yeah, so her position, as I understand it, is that, well, as I understand her meta-ontological position, is that terms come with application conditions.
Right.
And these are the conditions in which you're allowed to kind of refer to this term. And if so, there are kind of these application conditions are essentially semantic rules. And if the application conditions are met, then you're allowed to use the term, you're allowed to refer. And so we say the thing exists. And that, she calls the meta-ontological position deflationary, but the ontological position is quite bloated, actually. It comes with a lot of objects.
That's right. Although at the same time, she tries to explain that bloated is the wrong metaphor. It's really not bloated because it's easy. Right? Yeah.
Well, what I found to be quite compelling about her position is that in bringing in these application conditions, it seemed to me that she was relying on what seemed to me a very strong insight, which is that, to talk about anything, you need to understand. You need to have what it is that you're talking about, right? And so there really must be these application conditions. And so to say, and then to sort of deflate existence beyond that and say, well, all existence is whether these are met or not. That seemed pretty compelling to me when I read it. What is your sort of response to that kind of approach?
It's a great question because you have placed the pressure on exactly where we disagree. And it turns out our real disagreement, and this happens a lot in metaphysics and in metametaphysics, the disagreement turns out to be one over language, natural language, and not over metaphysical principles of any sort. I disagree with her exactly on the claim about application conditions. Okay, not with respect to all words. I think there's a whole class of words that do have application conditions, and she often cites these words: contract, strike, marriage. But there are a whole bunch of words that do not have these application conditions, and these are the words that our non-philosophers actually are focused on. Words like zebra, berry, electron, and words like exist and object. Now, what they do have, which is what enables us to be able to use them, are provisional, what I sometimes call de facto application conditions. But these are recognized not to be part of the meaning of the words and to be subject to change. And an example is, and I give examples of this in the book, where it turns out that we have the coral, and everybody thinks that coral, I believe this is the way the example goes, I do it accurately, we think that it's a kind of plant, and it turns out it's not, it's an animal. Or we have this word berry, and we have conditions on what berries are, and it turns out those aren't the right conditions. The whole thing about all of these other words, which I call criterion transcendent words, which are, as I said, are the words that are at the center of ontological debates among non-philosophers, is that they don't have application conditions. They only have these provisional ones, and over time they change. These words are in a very striking way open-ended semantically. And my claim is that she's just wrong about the language, natural language. And I also claim that this is something that's not for philosophers to dictate. This is a matter of linguistics, and in many cases, lexical semantics. So I'm taking my marching orders from there, and that's why I say she's wrong. So it's an interesting case, because with a lot of these metaphysical debates between me and her, between me and Hofweber, me and Chalmers, and Eli Hirsch, the debate is taking place on that's not the way natural language works. You're just distorting the way natural language works. Now, whether I'm right or wrong is to be dictated, but I think it's to be dictated by linguistic science.
Right. Which, I mean, so everything you said makes sense. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about, because it strikes me that, you know, in order to have this sort of equal playing ground, in order to have a phenomena that we're all supposed to be kind of trying to account for, you know, it's natural to kind of go to our intuitive sort of notions in natural language. But then it's also true that those really are very messy and often, you know,
hard to see clearly. Yeah. And subtle, and yeah, absolutely.
And it's also interesting that at that point then, philosophy, and in particular this highly, highly abstract kind of reasoning that we're doing about ontology and metaontology, now gets beholden to this very messy question, this very messy empirical question of what natural language is actually like.
Let me give you quickly another example, really straightforward example, but it has big ramifications. Take the word exist. For that matter, take the phrase there is. Are they, do they have one meaning, or do they have more than one meaning? My disagreements with Hofweber turn on the answer to that question. I claim the answer to that question, again, is a matter of linguistics, that there are good linguistic tests for ambiguity, and that we have to take them seriously. But it turns out it changes things in esoteric metaphysics and philosophical debates drastically. Something as homey as that. So, yeah. Now, of course, once we're done figuring out natural language, we can ask ourselves a different question. Should we change it in some way? Should we regiment? Should we start speaking an artificial language to continue doing this? Another question. But the debate is mostly taking place about natural language.
All right, Jody, thank you so much. I'm gonna leave it there. I'm sure we could go on for hours, but I think that it's a really clear introduction to your position. So thank you.
Thank you.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.